Guten Tag und willkommen to my Germany vlog. This is episode 5, and this episode we're going to look at the war in sight crisis of 1875, and this is the final episode on Bismarck. And actually the war in sight crisis is a strange thing, I think, to have put into what is otherwise a very domestic focused depth topic by the exam board. For that reason, I think it's quite a likely thing perhaps that could come up as a source question one year, or else you might use it as one of the ways in which Bismarck tried to deal with threats that he saw to the German Empire, that there were difficulties in ruling the German Empire and difficulties in keeping it together and in creating a sort of sense of unified Germany, and that this could fit in as an example of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the actual crisis itself, but also I'm going to talk a little bit about the surrounding events in terms of foreign policy to try and give you some sort of context for understanding that, even though they're not explicitly on the curriculum. So the first thing to remember is that Bismarck's foreign policy was based around two main objectives, and really they're linked, I suppose. The first is that he wanted to maintain peace and stability in the 1870s so that Germany, newly created Germany, could grow and develop and prosper, and I guess so that Germans could get used to being German and united, and that Germany would be able to develop in a kind of natural way. And because of that, because he saw the key threat to that as being France, his second aim was to maintain the diplomatic isolation of France. And this, of course, makes sense because France had been the loser in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, which had established Germany. And so he wants to make sure that they are not in a position to take revenge anytime soon. Bismarck himself said, "When we have arrived in a good harbour, we should be content to cultivate and hold what we have." So for that reason, in 1873, Bismarck entered the Drei Kaiserbund. Drei Kaiserbund, it's all one word. Drei is D-R-E-I, Kaiser is spelled like Kaiser, K-A-I-S-E-R, Bund is B-U-N-D, all one word, Drei Kaiserbund. It means the Three Emperors League. And it comprised Austria, Germany and Russia in an informal alliance where they agreed to help each other out if any one of them were attacked by someone else. In other words, if France attacked Germany, Austria and Russia had both agreed to come to their aid. And this provides some further isolation for France, because Austria and Russia are now committed to not helping them in a war against Germany. And also it maintains some peace and stability because, again, Russia and Austria have committed not to pick on Germany. However, in the following couple of years from the establishment of the Drei Kaiserbund, Bismarck's fears about France increased. France had recovered from its defeat in 1871. It was rearming. In fact, the French Army Reorganisation Law of 1873 had increased the number of infantry battalions from 3 to 4, which doesn't seem like a huge increase, but it meant that German estimates said that within 5 years France would have around 800,000 trained men to draw on in any attack on Germany, because they were training and then policing and stuff. So this seems to be quite an aggressive step forward. Of course, France was Catholic, and at this point in the 1870s it had a royalist government which was trying to increase their own prestige through an aggressive foreign policy. A royalist government is important as well because a republican government was less popular with the monarchies of Russia and Austria, who were potential allies for France, whereas a royalist government was more palatable to those two countries. And of course, Bismarck was concerned that Catholic French government was also going to look back at the defeat in 1871 and see Germany as the ideal target for an aggressive foreign policy, because revenge was such a strong motive. And so in 1875, Bismarck stoked fear of French rearmament through manipulating a telegram again, and through kind of pretending that there was a bigger threat of war than there actually was. In fact, I mean, inventing really a threat of war. And so the German newspaper headlines were, "Is war in sight?" Bismarck creates this crisis really out of his own fear and through his actions, and it all backfires and blows up in his face. It's actually very embarrassing, even verging on humiliating for Bismarck, because the Kaiser steps in to deal with it, as if Bismarck is not, as Chancellor, is not kind of capable, hasn't got the diplomatic authority to sort this out. So the Tsar of Russia comes to Germany or meets with the Kaiser, and they sort things out together. It actually weakens Russian-German relations, and Russia and Britain as well both back France in the dispute. So actually Bismarck's hope was that France would remain isolated, but what happens is that it becomes less isolated because France is now backed by Britain and Russia. As a result, Bismarck became more careful in his rhetoric towards France, and perhaps this is one of the things that weakens his commitment to the culture camp as well in the next couple of years. 1875 was the high point of the culture camp, but from this point on, with the death of the Pope and things, Bismarck becomes less attached to that. So the War in Sight crisis is an example of where Bismarck's fears about the threat to France were, a bit like with socialism, were over-exaggerated, where he intervened in a way that did not help the situation and in fact made it worse, and where he kind of has to retreat and be more humble in the future. However, Bismarck's foreign policy, ironically, across the stretch of his career is a real strength. He had manipulated foreign policy in order to create Germany. The Dry Kaiserbund was a sensible step of that. And the War in Sight crisis is really the kind of the one big defeat for him. In the mid to late 1870s, there was trouble in the Balkans, where we would now think of as kind of Albania, Croatia, Macedonia kind of area, with revolts against the Ottoman Empire. Russia and Austria were both interested in this area and both wanted to have influence over this area. And so in 1878, at the Congress of Berlin, Bismarck goes to act as an honest broker. To reduce, he's not an honest broker in the slightest, but yeah, he's there to reduce Balkan tension and maintain the peace. He does end up doing that, and it's a triumph for Bismarck, and this is kind of his foreign policy success. He does so at the expense of upsetting Russia, which brings about an end to the Dry Kaiserbund. But in 1879, he does enter into the dual alliance with Austria, and then expands that in 1882 to the Triple Alliance with Italy as well. Bismarck's theory being that, you know, if there are 5 powers at play, it was better to be on the side that had more powers. So he has this idea of alliances working together in order to protect Germany. That's a policy that is continued through the 1880s, and the Dry Kaiserbund is re-established. And in 1887, a secret treaty is signed between Russia and Germany, which guaranteed neutrality in any conflict with a third power. This is a sneaky treaty because, of course, it didn't make any mention of Austria, but what it meant was that Germany was guaranteeing to stay out of any war that Russia had with Austria in the future, and likewise that Russia was agreeing to stay out of any war that Germany had in the future. This would have been a handy alliance for Germany to have maintained, or treaty for Germany to maintain through to the First World War, of course, but Kaiser Wilhelm II allows that to lapse in the 1890s, and that's one of the reasons that the Triple Entente is put together between Britain, France and Russia, which causes Germany so many problems in the First World War. However, that's skipping ahead. Just for this depth topic, the War in Sight crisis is the only thing the exam will say you must know about Bismarck's foreign policy. And just to recap, he manipulates his worries about France into creating a crisis where the question is asked, is war in sight? Are the French looking to start a war with us because they're rearming? Actually, one of the things it shows, of course, is that the fears of the army are easily stray into German politics, particularly under Bismarck, and that this crisis leads to Bismarck having to pull back and step down and be conciliatory. I hope that's helped, and I'll see you next time when we'll skip on to depth topic 2, which looks at the end of the First World War and the establishment of the Weimar Republic. See you then.